Textbooks call him the Mad King. He is remembered as a national disgrace, a ruler who pushed his wife into his doctor's bed while indulging in masturbation and erratic behavior. History has branded him a hopeless tyrant, but history is wrong. Christian VII was not a perpetrator, he was a victim. This is the record of a hostage situation that lasted 59 years. Beneath the crown lay a terrified boy, beaten daily by his own guardians until his mind shattered. He begged to save the only friend and wife who ever loved him, but was forced to sign their death warrants with his own hand. It is time to face the true tragedy of Christian VII, a man whose soul was destroyed while sitting on the throne. Christian was born in January 1749 into the House of Oldenburg, a dynasty rotting from the inside out. Christiansborg Palace was no fairy tale castle. It was a cold, drafty monument to a family in decline. His father, King Frederick V, was beloved by the public, but the public only saw the mask. In private, Frederick was a disaster. He was a high-functioning alcoholic who viewed sobriety as a temporary inconvenience between binges. He chased women and wine with equal ferocity, letting his body decay while he sat on the throne. He fled from reality, leaving the country to his ministers, while he drowned in debauchery. This was Christian's inheritance, a father who was physically present but spiritually absent, a man who looked at his son and saw only a burden. For the first few years, however, there was a shield, Queen Louise, the daughter of King George II. She was the moral center of the Danish court. She was vibrant, kind, and loved her son fiercely, standing between him and his father's neglect. For a brief moment, Christian had warmth. He had safety. But the House of Oldenburg was cursed. When Christian was not yet 3 years old, Queen Louise died suddenly. She was only 27. The court performed the pageantry of grief with black armbands and hymns, but no one noticed the little boy's world had ended. With Louise gone, the shield vanished. The light went out in Christiansborg. Frederick didn't step up to be a father. He retreated further into the bottle, unable to look at the son who reminded him of his dead wife. Christian was left alone in the nursery, a toddler wandering the halls of power, surrounded by servants paid to care for him, but not to love him. He was not just neglected, he was about to be replaced. Under immense pressure from his ministers to provide more heirs, just in case the sickly Christian didn't survive, King Frederick remarried. Enter Juliana Maria of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. In the fairy tales we tell our children, the stepmother is always evil, a caricature of wickedness. Juliana Maria was not a cartoon. She was something far more dangerous. She was cold, calculating, and fiercely ambitious. She looked at Christian, the crown prince, and she didn't see a stepson who had just lost his mother. She saw an obstacle. She saw a placeholder occupying the seat that should belong to her own bloodline. When she quickly gave birth to her own son, Prince Frederick, her loyalty shifted instantly and completely. Every breath Christian took was one too many in her eyes. If Christian disappeared or if he was proven unfit, her son would be king. She didn't abuse him directly with her own hands. She did something worse. She rendered him invisible. She isolated him, pushing him into the shadows, leaving him starving for affection. She created an environment where the crown prince was an outsider in his own home, while her biological son was praised and coddled. But the true damage didn't come from her indifference. It came from the man hired to make him a king. The destruction of Christian's mind was not an accident. It was a project. The man tasked with this project was Count Christian Ditlev Reventlow. History remembers him as a strict tutor, a man of his time. We should call him what he truly was, a sadist and a child abuser. The king, too drunk to care, and 2 checked out to monitor the education of his heir, gave Reventlow absolute authority over the crown prince. Reventlow believed in a pedagogical philosophy that was brutal even by 18th century standards. He believed that the only way to mold a man was to break the boy. He didn't teach Christian statecraft, philosophy, or leadership. He taught him fear. The lessons were daily sessions of torture. If Christian stuttered, he was beaten. If he failed to memorize a line of Latin, he was flogged. If he showed hesitation, he was humiliated. But it wasn't just physical pain, it was psychological warfare. Reventlow would strip the prince of his dignity, telling him he was worthless, stupid, weak, and an embarrassment to his rank. Imagine the psychology of this for a moment. Christian was not a dullard. He was a sensitive, highly intelligent child with a vivid imagination and a desperate need to please. But every time he showed his personality, he was punished. He learned that to be himself was dangerous. He learned that visibility equaled pain. The physical toll was horrifying. Servants whispered about the sounds coming from the schoolroom, the rhythmic thud of the cane and the muffled sobs of the future king. The young prince began to suffer from seizures. He would foam at the mouth after a beating, his small body convulsing on the floor, while his tutor looked on with disdain, viewing the physical reaction as just another sign of weakness that needed to be beaten out of him. Modern doctors, looking back at the records, suspect this might have been the early onset of porphyria, the same royal malady that plagued King George III. But the trigger wasn't just genetics. The trigger was trauma. Reventlow wasn't just beating a child. He was beating a genetic time bomb, accelerating a mental collapse that might otherwise have been managed. By the time Christian entered his teenage years, the damage was irreversible. The sweet, sensitive boy was gone. In his place was something fragmented, a personality that had shattered into jagged pieces. Christian developed a defense mechanism that was as tragic as it was destructive. He decided that if he couldn't be the perfect king, he would be the monster they treated him as. He became obsessed with hardening himself. He internalized Reventlow's voice, believing that he was too soft, too feminine, too weak. So he tried to beat the weakness out of his own body. This is where the stories of the Mad King truly begin, not as acts of lunacy, but as acts of desperate survival. He started wandering the streets of Copenhagen at night. He wasn't looking for romance or adventure. He was looking for violence. He carried a Morgenstern, a spiked Morning Star Club. He and his gang of sycophants would attack night watchmen, break windows, and start brawls in brothels. He wanted to feel pain because pain was the only thing that felt real. He wanted to inflict pain because it was the only language of power he had ever been taught. In the privacy of his chambers, the behavior was even more disturbing. He engaged in self-mutilation. He would burn his own skin with candles, watching the flesh blister without flinching. He built a rack in his chambers, a torture device, and paid people to tie him down and flog him. He would rub salt into his own wounds, gritting his teeth, trying to prove he was a man, trying to kill the sensitive boy inside him. But then the flip side would emerge, the terrifying innocence. One moment he was a thug, the next he was a child. He would leapfrog over dignitaries who bowed to him in the court. He would slap ambassadors in the face during diplomatic receptions and then giggle uncontrollably. He wasn't just being rude, he was dissociating. His reality was slipping. He began to hallucinate, claiming he was a changeling, that his real father wasn't the king, that he was the son of Catherine the Great of Russia. He was looking for any identity other than his own, any reality where he wasn't Christian the Seventh, the beaten boy of Christiansborg. In January 1766, the inevitable happened. King Frederick V, his liver finally surrendering to years of abuse, died. Christian was now King Christian VII. He was 17 years old. He was terrified. He was mentally unraveling, and he was now the absolute ruler of a dual monarchy. The court looked at their new king and saw the cracks in the porcelain. They saw the twitching, the paranoia, the sudden outbursts of violence. Their solution to his madness was the standard royal panacea, marriage. They believed a good woman would calm him down, would domesticate the beast. They imported a bride from England, his first cousin, Princess Caroline Matilda. She was 15 years old. She was the sister of King George III. She was innocent, chubby, rosy-cheeked, and completely unprepared for the shark tank of the Danish court. When she arrived, she expected a fairy tale. She expected a dashing young king. What she got was a horror story. Christian was repulsed by her, not because she was unattractive, she was lovely, but because she represented obligation. She represented the sane world he couldn't fit into. She represented the demands of the state, the very thing that had allowed Reventlow to torture him. He famously declared that it was unfashionable to love one's wife. He refused to sleep with her. He refused to speak to her. Poor Caroline Matilda was left alone in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. Her only company was the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, the stepmother-in-law from hell, who hated her instantly because Caroline carried the potential heir that would displace Juliana's own son. Christian, meanwhile, was actively humiliating his new bride. He paraded his mistress, a courtesan named Stavlet Catherine, or Boots Catherine, through the court. It was a public display of disrespect. He took Catherine to the theater, to state dinners, forcing the nobility to bow to a woman of the streets, while his anointed queen sat alone in her chambers, weeping and writing desperate letters home to England that would never be fully answered. Against all biological odds, and likely due to the immense pressure of his advisors who practically forced him into the marital bed, Christian managed to impregnate Caroline Matilda. In 1768, the future King Frederick VI was born. The court breathed a sigh of relief. The succession was secured. But for Christian, the birth of his son was not a joyous occasion. It was the completion of a chore. He had done his job. He had provided the heir. Now he wanted to escape. The walls of the palace were closing in on him. The voices in his head were getting louder. He felt the eyes of his stepmother burning into his back, waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to die. He needed to get away from Denmark, away from the memories of Reventlow's cane, away from the wife he didn't love, and away from the responsibilities he couldn't handle. He demanded a grand tour of Europe. The ministers agreed, hoping that travel would mature the young king, hoping that the fresh air of foreign courts would clear the fog from his mind. They didn't know it yet, but they were sending him straight into the arms of the man who would destroy the monarchy as they knew it. They were sending him to find the only person who would ever treat him like a human being. The grand tour was supposed to be a cure. Instead, it was a carnival of chaos that paraded the broken king across the stage of Europe. When Christian VII left Copenhagen in May 1768, the court breathed a collective sigh of relief, hoping that the rigorous schedule of diplomatic visits would snap him out of his malaise. They were wrong. The tour became a traveling circus of embarrassment. In London, King George III, Christian's brother-in-law, was horrified by the Danish monarch. Christian was bored by the pomp and circumstance, visibly rolling his eyes during state dinners and making inappropriate jokes to dignitaries who didn't know where to look. He spent his nights incognito, scouring the seedier sides of London and Paris, looking for the same adrenaline rush of violence and debauchery he had sought in the back alleys of Copenhagen. He was a king running away from his shadow, but the shadow was stitched to his heels. He was 20 years old, the ruler of a dual monarchy, and he was utterly, devastatingly alone in a crowd of thousands. But fate, which had been so cruel to Christian up to this point, was about to offer him a lifeline in the unlikely town of Altona. It was here, on the edge of the Danish realm, that the king met Johann Friedrich Struensee. On paper, Struensee was nobody. He was a 31-year-old physician, the son of a pietist pastor, a man of the middle class with no noble blood and no political standing. But in person, he was magnetic. He was a man of the Enlightenment, an atheist, a progressive thinker, a believer in science and reason, in a world still ruled by superstition and divine right. He didn't look at Christian and see a deity to be worshipped or a madman to be feared. He saw a patient. He saw a young man whose nervous system had been shattered by trauma and whose intellect was starving for stimulation. When Struensee spoke to the king, he didn't bow and scrape. He didn't use the flowery, empty language of the court sycophants. He spoke directly. He spoke with authority, but not the terrifying authority of Reventlow. It was the calm, steady authority of a doctor who knows exactly what is wrong and exactly how to fix it. For Christian, who had spent his entire life being either beaten or ignored, this was intoxicating. Struensee listened to him. He engaged with Christian's philosophical ramblings, taking them seriously rather than dismissing them as the ravings of a lunatic. He offered medical explanations for the king's physical pain and mental anguish, replacing the terrifying notion of demonic madness with the manageable concept of illness. Christian fell under his spell almost instantly. He begged Struensee to join the royal retinue as the traveling physician. The court advisors, desperate for anyone who could manage the king's erratic moods, agreed. They thought they were hiring a doctor. They didn't realize they were hiring the man who would effectively steal the crown. By the time the tour returned to Copenhagen in early 1769, the dynamic had shifted fundamentally. Christian was no longer the lonely boy wandering the halls. He had a keeper. Struensee was installed in the palace, and his influence began to spread like a virus through the calcified veins of the Danish court. The old ministers hated him. They saw a German upstart, a commoner who dared to whisper in the king's ear, but they couldn't touch him, because for the first time in years the king was manageable. Struensee had become the hoarse whisperer for the monarch. He could talk Christian down from his manic episodes. He could soothe his paranoia. He gave the king a sense of safety he hadn't felt since his mother died. However, there was one person in the palace who viewed Struensee with absolute suspicion: Queen Caroline Matilda. She had spent the months of the king's absence in isolation, growing lonelier and more depressed by the day. She was sick, suffering from dropsy and a deep, crushing melancholy. When Christian returned with this arrogant German doctor in tow, she wanted nothing to do with him. She saw Struensee as just another one of the king's favorites, another drinking buddy who would encourage his worst instincts. Struensee, however, had a different plan. He knew that for his position to be secure, he couldn't just be the king's friend. He had to stabilize the king's environment. And the biggest source of instability was the disastrous royal marriage. Struensee did something that no courtier had ever dared to do. He told the king to grow up. He told Christian that if he wanted to be respected, he had to respect his wife. He prescribed a reconciliation not as a moral duty, but as a medical necessity for a peaceful life. Reluctantly, Christian began to visit the queen's chambers, not for romance, but for civil conversation, with Struensee often present as a mediator. At the same time, Struensee began to treat the queen's physical ailments. He was a skilled physician, arguably one of the best of his generation. He treated her dropsy successfully. He inoculated the Crown Prince Frederick against smallpox, a radical and dangerous procedure at the time that saved the boy's life. Caroline Matilda watched this man save her son. She watched him speak to her husband with a firmness that actually yielded results. She watched him treat her not as a broodmare for the state, but as an intelligent woman. She was 19 years old, starved of affection, intellectual stimulation, and human touch. Struensee was 33, handsome, brilliant, and powerful. The friction between them, born of suspicion, ignited into something else entirely. It started with long walks in the palace gardens, discussing Voltaire and Rousseau, discussing the backwardness of the Danish laws, discussing the freedom of the human spirit. It ended in the Queen's bedchamber. By the spring of 1770, the Queen of Denmark and the royal physician were lovers. This should have been the moment the House of Cards collapsed. In any other royal court, the king would have discovered the betrayal, and heads would have rolled. But the court of Christian VII was not a normal court. When Christian realized what was happening, or at least when he sensed the shift in dynamic, he didn't fly into a rage. He didn't call for the executioner. He felt relief. It was a twisted, tragic form of salvation. Christian found the demands of being a husband exhausting. He found the emotional needs of his wife terrifying. With Struensee occupying Caroline Matilda's heart and bed, the pressure was off. The Queen was happy, which meant she stopped nagging him. Struensee was happy, which meant he stayed calm and continued to manage the affairs of state. Christian, famously and bizarrely, seemed to encourage the affair. He would leave them alone together. He would insist that Struensee sit next to the Queen at dinner. The three of them formed a ménage à trois that was less about sexual depravity and more about a broken man finding a support system that finally worked. Christian called them his family. For a brief, shining moment, the madness receded. He had a father figure and a wife who were distracted by each other, leaving him free to retreat into his own world without the constant fear of failure. With the king pacified and the queen in love, Struensee's ambition broke its leash. He realized that he held the absolute power of the monarchy in his hands. In Denmark's absolutist system, the king's signature was law, and the king would sign anything Struensee put in front of him. Struensee didn't just want to be a favorite. He wanted to change the world. He looked at Denmark and saw a feudal relic, a place of serfdom, torture, censorship, and corruption. He decided to fix it, all of it, at once. In late 1770, Struensee orchestrated the dissolution of the Council of State. He kicked out the old gray-bearded ministers who had ignored Christian's abuse for years. He appointed himself Privy Cabinet Minister, giving him the authority to issue orders with the force of royal decrees. And then the paper blizzard began. This period is known in Danish history as the Time of Struensee. It was a legislative blitzkrieg. In the span of 16 months, Struensee issued over 1,800 cabinet orders. That is an average of more than 3 new laws every single day. He worked with a manic intensity, fueled by coffee and the arrogance of a man who believes he is the smartest person in the room. He abolished the torture of prisoners. He banned the slave trade. He abolished press censorship, allowing total freedom of speech for the first time in Danish history. He slashed the bloated military budget. He fired the corrupt courtiers who held sinecures, jobs with high pay and no work. He cleaned the literal filth from the streets of Copenhagen. He opened the royal parks to the public. He founded hospitals for unwed mothers and forbade the police from arresting prostitutes, viewing poverty as a social issue rather than a criminal one. It was the Enlightenment imposed by decree. It was brilliant. It was necessary. And it was political suicide. Struensee made a fatal error. He forgot that he was a foreigner in a xenophobic land. He didn't speak Danish, and he didn't bother to learn. All his decrees were written in German, the language of the enemy. To the Danish nobility, this wasn't progress, it was an occupation. They watched with horror as this German doctor dismantled their privileges, fired their cousins, and mocked their traditions. They watched as the queen, emboldened by her lover, began to dress in men's clothing, riding astride her horse in breeches, smoking cigars, and laughing in the face of protocol. They watched as the king, their anointed sovereign, was reduced to a rubber stamp, a ghost wandering the background of his own reign. Christian's condition began to deteriorate again. The stability provided by Struensee was a double-edged sword. As Struensee became busier with running the country, he had less time to whisper to the king. Christian was left to his own devices, and his mind drifted back into the dark waters of hallucination. He felt his power slipping away, and even though he had willingly surrendered it, the reality of his impotence began to chafe. He started to have violent outbursts again. On one occasion, he refused to sign a document. When Count Brandt, Struensee's abrasive assistant, tried to force him, the king attacked him. Brandt, forgetting his place, bit the king's finger and struck him in the face. It was treason. It was a death sentence. But nothing happened. Struensee protected Brandt. The king of Denmark had been beaten by a commoner in his own palace, and there was no retribution. The whispers in the capital turned into a roar. The freedom of the press that Struensee had granted was immediately weaponized against him. Pamphlets flooded the streets depicting Struensee and the queen in pornographic detail. They called him a usurper, a sorcerer who had bewildered the king with drugs. They called the queen a great whore of Babylon. And in the shadows, the dowager queen, Juliana Maria, smiled. She had been waiting for years for Christian to fail. Now she saw that he hadn't just failed. He had been erased. She saw the military officers who had been fired. She saw the clergy who were scandalized by the atheism at court. She saw the nobles who had lost their easy money. She realized she had an army. The breaking point came in July 1771, when Queen Caroline Matilda gave birth to a daughter, Princess Louise Augusta. The king recognized the child, but the entire country knew better. The baby had Struensee's eyes. They called her La Petite Struensee. The legitimacy of the royal line was now in question. This was no longer just a scandal. It was a dynastic crisis. Juliana Maria knew the time for waiting was over. She began to hold secret meetings in her chambers, gathering the disgruntled, the fired, and the hateful. They needed a plan to remove the doctor and the queen without killing the king. They needed a coup. The tension in Copenhagen was palpable. The winter of 1771 was bitter and cold. Struensee, sensing the danger, moved the court to Kronborg Castle and then to Christiansborg, trying to isolate the king and queen from the angry mobs. But he was arrogant to the end. He refused to believe that the Danes would rise up against the man who had given them freedom. He refused to believe that the broken king could ever be turned against him. He was wrong. He had underestimated the malice of a stepmother's scorn, and he had overestimated the strength of a mind he had spent years drugging with reassurance. The stage was set for a night of blood, betrayal, and the final destruction of Christian VII's fragile world. The night of January 16th, 1772, was the culmination of a tragedy that had been rotting the Danish court from the inside for years. It was the night of a masked ball at Christiansborg Palace, a final grotesque display of the old world dancing on the edge of a precipice. The atmosphere was thick with a tension that was almost physical, a static charge that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. King Christian VII was there, moving through the crowd like a marionette with cut strings, his eyes darting nervously behind his mask, manic energy radiating from his small, trembling frame. He played cards, he laughed too loudly, he drifted through the rooms, a ghost haunting his own party. Queen Caroline Matilda was there, radiant and defiant, dancing with her lover, Count Struensee. They moved with the reckless abandon of people who believe they are untouchable, blind to the knives being sharpened in the shadows. Struensee, arrogant to the bitter end, dismissed the rumors of a coup as the idle gossip of a defeated nobility. He believed in the power of reason. He believed that because his reforms were logical, they were secure. He forgot that politics is not about logic, it is about power, and he was about to learn that lesson in the most brutal way possible. Watching them from the perimeter was the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria. She did not dance, she did not smile. She watched the German doctor and the whore queen with the cold, predatory patience of a reptile. Beside her stood her son, the hereditary Prince Frederick, a man of limited intelligence but unlimited entitlement, and Ove Hoeg Guldberg, the intellectual architect of the conspiracy. Guldberg was a nationalist, a conservative, and a man who hated Struensee with a religious fervor. He had convinced Juliana that this was not just a political struggle, but a holy war to save the soul of Denmark. They had gathered their allies, Colonel Köhler of the Palace Guard, disenchanted nobles, and officers who had been purged by Struensee's reforms. The plan was simple, bloody, and contingent on one single fragile point of failure, the mind of the king. They knew they could not depose Christian. He was God's anointed. To succeed, they had to make Christian destroy his own world. They had to weaponize his trauma. At 4 a.m., the music had faded, the guests had departed, and the palace had settled into a heavy, drunken silence. The conspirators moved. They didn't sneak, they marched. Juliana Maria, Guldberg, and the hereditary prince, accompanied by armed guards, walked through the dark corridors of the palace toward the king's bedchamber. They carried a single candle, a flickering light in the vast darkness, casting long, distorted shadows against the tapestries. Christian was asleep. When the door to his chamber burst open, he woke in a state of primal terror. Imagine the scene through his eyes. He is 22 years old, mentally unstable and paranoid. He wakes up to find his room filled with armed men and his terrifying stepmother looming over his bed like a specter of judgment. This was his nightmare made flesh. He scrambled back against the headboard, pulling the sheets up to his chin, a frightened child, staring at the monsters he always knew were coming. Juliana Maria did not hesitate. She didn't offer comfort. She offered a lie so monstrous and so tailored to his paranoia that it shattered his remaining grip on reality. She told him that a plot had been discovered. She told him that Struensee and Caroline Matilda were planning to murder him that very night. She told him that the people outside were not invaders, but his rescuers, and that he had mere moments to act before the assassin struck. Sign, she demanded, thrusting a stack of arrest warrants onto the bed. Sign, or you will die. Christian froze. His mind, already fractured, couldn't process the betrayal. Struensee was his friend. Caroline was his wife. They were his family. No, he stammered, tears streaming down his face. Struensee would not hurt me. He loves me. But Guldberg and Juliana pressed him. They screamed at him. They filled the room with the pressure of their hatred, suffocating him. They told him he was weak, that he was letting the traitors win, that he was failing his country. They reenacted the trauma of his childhood, becoming the voice of Reventlow, the voice of the abuser. Christian looked for an escape, but there was none. He was cornered, hyperventilating, shaking so violently he could barely hold the quill. The King of Denmark broke. He scribbled his signature at the bottom of the papers, Christian Rex. With 2 words, he signed the death warrant of his best friend and the destruction of his wife. He collapsed back onto the pillow sobbing, while Juliana Maria snatched the papers from his hand. The coup was legal. The king had spoken. The violence that followed was swift. Colonel Kuller and his men marched to Struensee's chambers. The dictatorial doctor, who had ruled Denmark with a stroke of his pen, was dragged from his bed in his nightshirt, shackled and hauled away without a shred of dignity. Count Brandt was arrested moments later. But the most heart-wrenching scene took place in the Queen's chambers. Caroline Matilda woke to the sound of heavy boots and raised voices. She realized instantly what was happening. She didn't cower, she fought. She tried to rush to the king's room, knowing that if she could just reach Christian, if she could just look him in the eye, she could snap him out of Juliana's spell. She ran into the hallway screaming for her husband, but she was met by a wall of bayonets. The soldiers blocked her path. She fought them physically, a desperate mother fighting for her life and the lives of her children. But she was overpowered. She was dragged back to her room, allowed only to hastily dress and grab her infant daughter, Louise Augusta. Her son, the Crown Prince Frederick, was ripped from her care. She was shoved into a carriage and driven north to Kronborg Castle, the fortress of Hamlet, to rot in a cold cell. She would never see Copenhagen again. When the sun rose over the capital on January 17th, 1772, the world had changed. The news of the arrest spread like wildfire. And here lies one of the darkest ironies of this story. The people cheered. The common people of Copenhagen, the very people Struensee had tried to liberate from serfdom and censorship, flooded the streets to celebrate his fall. They didn't see a liberator. They saw a foreign upstart who had disrespected their king and corrupted their queen. They lit bonfires. They smashed the windows of brothels. They chanted, "Long live King Christian! Long live Queen Juliana!" And Christian? He was paraded through the city in a golden carriage. He sat beside his stepmother and his half-brother, waving to the cheering crowds. He was dressed in his finery, smiling a vacant, hollow smile. To the mob, he looked like a monarch restored to his glory. To anyone who looked closer, he was a hostage. He had been saved from the doctor, only to be enslaved by the stepmother. He was manic, laughing inappropriately, pointing at the crowds and shouting nonsense. He thought perhaps that this was a game. He thought that maybe Struensee was just in a time-out, that everything would go back to normal. He didn't understand that the machine he had set in motion could not be stopped. The interrogation of Johann Friedrich Struensee was a masterclass in brutality. The great reformer was thrown into a dungeon, chained to the wall in the dark. He was not a warrior. He was an intellectual, a man of soft hands and high ideals. He was not built for pain. The inquisitors wanted a confession, but not just to treason. Treason wasn't enough to justify the sheer hatred the nobility felt for him. They needed moral depravity. They needed him to confess to sleeping with the queen. At first, Struensee denied it. He tried to protect Caroline Matilda's honor, but every man has a breaking point, and Struensee's was reached quickly. Under the threat of torture and perhaps the promise of a lighter sentence, he cracked. He confessed to the affair. He gave them the dates, the times, the details. He sold out the woman he loved in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save his own skin. It was the final betrayal in a saga built on them. With Struensee's confession in hand, the conspirators turned their sights on the queen. They presented the confession to her at Kronborg. Caroline Matilda, sick and heartbroken, initially denied everything. But when they showed her Struensee's signature, her resistance crumbled. She realized she was alone. The divorce proceedings were a sham, a show trial designed to humiliate her and strip her of her title. The marriage was dissolved. She was no longer Queen of Denmark. She was a prisoner of state. But the bloodlust of the coup leaders was not sated by divorce. They wanted a spectacle. On April 25th, Struensee and Brandt were sentenced to death. The sentence was medieval in its cruelty. They were to have their right hands cut off. Then they were to be beheaded, their bodies drawn and quartered, and their heads displayed on spikes. Christian VII was arguably the only person who could have stopped it. He was the king. He had the power of pardon, but Christian was being kept in a state of induced confusion. Juliana Maria and Guldberg surrounded him constantly, feeding him lies, keeping him distracted with balls and dinners, ensuring he never had a moment of clarity long enough to realize the finality of what was coming. Yet, there are reports that he was uneasy. He asked where Struensee was. He asked why his friend hadn't come to play cards. He was told that Struensee was traveling. On the morning of April 28, 1772, a scaffold was erected in Fælledparken in Copenhagen. 30,000 people gathered to watch. It was a festival of death. Struensee and Brandt were brought out in chains. Brandt went first. He was defiant, but the axe fell, and his life ended. Then it was Struensee's turn. The man who had tried to bring the Enlightenment to the north, who had tried to save the king from his demons, was dragged up the stairs. He was a trembling wreck. He had repented, finding religion in his final days, but it offered no physical comfort now. The executioner was clumsy. He missed the neck on the first swing, burying the axe in Struensee's shoulder. The crowd gasped. Struensee screamed. It took 3 blows to sever the head. The executioner held it up, dripping with blood, and the crowd roared. Back at the palace, the king was not told the exact moment it happened. But the connection between Christian and Struensee was so deep, so symbiotic, that many courtiers claimed the king felt it. He became agitated. He drew pictures of his friend. And then, when the truth was finally revealed to him, that Struensee was not traveling, but dead, butchered by the king's own signature, Christian did not scream. He did not rage. He went silent. It was a silence that would last for the rest of his life. The coup was complete. The progressive dream was dead. The time of Struensee was over, replaced by the time of Guldberg. The torture chambers were reopened. The censorship laws were reinstated. The serfs were bound back to the land. Denmark slid backward into the shadows of conservatism. Juliana Maria had won everything she ever wanted. She had the power, she had the prestige, and she had the king exactly where she wanted him. A hollowed-out shell, a puppet she could dance across the stage of statecraft to legitimize her own rule. Caroline Matilda was loaded onto a British frigate, the HMS Southampton. She stood on the deck as the ship sailed away from Kronborg, watching the castle disappear into the mist, weeping for the children she was leaving behind. She would be taken to Celle in Hanover to live out her days in a small castle, painting portraits of her lost children and singing sad songs at the piano. She died 3 years later, a victim of an epidemic, but mostly a victim of a broken heart. And Christian? The king remained. But the man was gone. The trauma of the coup, the guilt of the execution, and the absolute isolation that followed severed his last tether to the real world. He retreated into a permanent state of eccentricity. He became a ghost haunting the corridors of his own palace. He would sit for hours staring at nothing. He would have conversations with people who weren't there. But beneath the madness, the guilt festered. He knew, deep down, in the part of his brain that Reventlow hadn't been able to beat out of him, he knew he had killed the only person who had ever understood him. The tragedy of Christian VII is not just that he was mad. It is that he was sane enough to understand his own sins. He was a king who had been forced to murder his own salvation. And now he was left alone with the monsters who had made him do it. The court settled into a gray, oppressive normalcy. Juliana Maria ruled with an iron fist, convinced of her own righteousness. She believed the story was over. She believed the mad king was finished. She forgot that Christian had a son. She forgot that the little boy, Frederick, who had been ripped from his mother's arms, was watching. She forgot that trauma is hereditary, but so is vengeance. The boy was growing up in the shadow of his father's madness and his step-grandmother's cruelty, and he was taking notes. The final act of this tragedy was yet to be written, and it would not be played out with axes and scaffolds, but with a piece of paper and a moment of terrifying crystalline clarity. The silence that descended upon Copenhagen after the execution of Struensee was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. The chaotic, vibrant, dangerous energy of the Enlightenment had been extinguished, replaced by the suffocating grayness of the Guldberg period. Ove Høeg Guldberg, the nationalist theologian who had orchestrated the coup alongside Juliana Maria, became the de facto Prime Minister of Denmark. He was a man of small imagination and rigid morality, a bureaucrat who believed that change was a sin and that the social order was divinely ordained. Under his watch, the clock was turned back. The printing presses, which had briefly roared with the voices of dissent and debate, were gagged. The torture chambers, which Struensee had closed, were unlocked, the racks and thumbscrews dusted off and put back into service. The peasants, who had tasted a fleeting hope of freedom from their feudal landlords, were bound once again to the soil, property of the aristocracy in all but name. The message to the people was clear. The experiment is over. Go back to sleep. For King Christian VII, life became a waking nightmare of performative normalcy. He was no longer the erratic ruler who roamed the streets with a spiked club. He was something far more tragic. He was a prop. Juliana Maria and Guldberg understood that their power rested entirely on the legitimacy of the king's signature, so they kept him visible but voiceless. He was trotted out for state dinners, dressed in velvet and gold, his hair powdered, his medals shining. He sat at the head of the table, a living wax figure, while the court buzzed around him. Ambassadors noted the vacancy in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he held his fork, the way he would sometimes lean over and whisper to people who weren't there. He was a ghost haunting his own throne room. The Dowager Queen, Juliana Maria, was now the undisputed master of the realm. She reveled in her victory with a self-righteousness that borders on the sociopathic. In her letters to foreign courts, she painted herself as the savior of the monarchy, the benevolent mother who had rescued her poor stepson from the clutches of a sorcerer. She claimed with a delusion that is almost breathtaking that Christian loved her. She wrote that he viewed her as his support and his only true friend. It was a lie so audacious it could only exist in the vacuum of an absolute monarchy. In reality, Christian was terrified of her. She was the woman who had stood over his bed with armed men. She was the woman who had made him kill his best friend. Every time she entered the room, the king would shrink into himself, his eyes darting to the exits, a beaten dog waiting for the next blow. But Christian was not completely gone. The tragedy of his mental illness was that it was not a total blackout. It was a series of flickering lights. There were moments of lucidity, moments where the fog lifted just enough for him to see the wreckage of his life. In the royal archives, there are sketches found from this period drawn by the king's own hand. They are portraits of the people he had lost, Struensee and Brandt. These weren't the scribbles of a madman, but the tributes of a grieving friend. He knew, he remembered. The mad king was not oblivious to his crimes. He was tortured by them. He spent his days wandering the gardens of the palace, feeding the birds, talking to the trees, perhaps because the trees were the only living things in Denmark that didn't want something from him. He had been hollowed out by trauma, leaving a shell that Guldberg filled with decrees and laws that Christians signed without reading. He became a signature machine, Christian Rex. The name appeared on thousands of documents that undid the legacy of his friend, reinforcing the power of the stepmother who held his leash. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away in the German town of Celle, another tragedy was reaching its conclusion. Queen Caroline Matilda, the exiled whore queen, was dying. She had spent 3 years in a small castle, surrounded by a court of sympathetic attendants but cut off from the world that mattered. She painted portraits of her children, Crown Prince Frederick and Princess Louise Augusta, whom she had not seen since that terrifying night in January. She wrote letters to her brother, King George III of Great Britain, begging for news, begging for a chance to return, but the politics of Europe were cold and unforgiving. In May 1775, at the age of 23, she contracted scarlet fever. On her deathbed, she wrote a letter to her husband Christian, asserting her innocence one last time, a letter he likely never received or was never allowed to understand. She died as she had lived, a pawn in a game played by men who viewed her as disposable. Her death severed the last tangible link Christian had to the family he had briefly enjoyed. The triangle was completely destroyed. Struensee was dead. Caroline was dead. Only Christian remained, the survivor who wished he hadn't survived. But Juliana Maria had made a critical error in her calculations. She had focused all her energy on controlling the present king, believing that if she kept Christian subdued, her power was eternal. She forgot to look down. She forgot to look at the small, sickly boy standing in the shadows of the nursery. Crown Prince Frederick was growing up. Frederick was a child of trauma. He had been 4 years old when his mother was dragged away screaming. He had been 4 years old when his father effectively disappeared into madness. He was raised by the very woman who had destroyed his family. Juliana Maria tried to mold Frederick just as she had molded Christian, not through abuse, but through control. She wanted him to be weak. She wanted him to be dependent. She limited his education, keeping him away from the dangerous ideas of the Enlightenment. She surrounded him with spies and tutors loyal to Guldberg. The plan was to create another puppet, a Christian II, who would allow Juliana and her biological son to rule as regents indefinitely. They underestimated him. They looked at his slight physical frame. He was thin, pale, and not particularly athletic, and assumed his mind was equally frail. They were wrong. Frederick was his mother's son. Beneath the quiet, unassuming exterior lay a core of absolute steel. He learned early on that silence was his only weapon. In a court where every whisper was reported to the Dowager Queen, Frederick learned to say nothing. He observed. He watched his father being humiliated. He watched his step-grandmother preening in her stolen power. He watched the sycophants bowing to Guldberg, and he remembered everything. He became a cipher, a blank slate onto which Juliana projected her own arrogance, never realizing that the boy was sharpening a knife in his mind. As Frederick approached his teenage years, the political landscape began to shift. The Guldberg rule, for all its stability, was deeply unpopular. The economy was stagnating. The nobility, while happy to have their privileges back, were chafing under the rigid moralism and incompetence of Guldberg's administration. People began to look at the Crown Prince not as a child, but as an alternative. Frederick, despite his isolation, managed to make contact with the few men of integrity left in Denmark, most notably Andreas Peter Bernstorff, a brilliant statesman who had been pushed out by the conservative regime. Through secret letters and whispered conversations in the corners of ballrooms, a conspiracy began to form. It was a mirror image of the conspiracy of 1772, but this time the goal was not to destroy a king, but to liberate one. The crown prince knew that he could not act alone. He needed the king. Under Danish law, power resided solely in the monarch. As long as Christian VII signed Juliana's papers, Juliana was the law. To overthrow her, Frederick needed to get his father to sign his papers. It was a terrifying gamble. He would have to use the mad king against the people who controlled him. The crisis point was Frederick's confirmation. In April 1784, the crown prince turned 16. According to tradition, this was the age of majority. He should have been given a seat on the Council of State and a voice in the government. Juliana Maria saw this coming. She panicked. She knew that if Frederick gained a foothold, her regency was threatened. So she tried to rig the game. In the weeks leading up to the confirmation, Juliana and Guldberg drafted a set of instructions for the young prince. These were not guidelines, they were chains. The document stipulated that the crown prince would have a seat on the council, but he was forbidden from speaking unless spoken to. It stated that he could not propose laws. Most damningly, it stated that the king's signature would only be valid if it was countersigned by Guldberg. It was a constitutional coup, an attempt to strip the monarchy of its power and vest it permanently in the hands of the Dowager Queen's clique. They brought the document to Frederick and told him to sign it. They expected him to bow, to stutter, to submit. Instead, Frederick looked them in the eye and signed it without a word. Juliana exhaled. She thought she had won. She thought the boy was tamed. She didn't realize that Frederick signed it because he knew the paper was worthless. He knew that the only signature that mattered was his father's, and he had a plan to get it. The date was set, April 14th, 1784, the first session of the Council of State after the prince's confirmation. The atmosphere in Christiansborg was tense. Rumors were swirling. The court sensed that something was happening, but no one knew what. Juliana Maria sat confidently, believing her regency was secure for another generation. Guldberg shuffled his papers, preparing the agenda. The king, Christian VII, sat at the head of the table, staring into the middle distance, unaware that he was about to become the fulcrum of history once again. Frederick walked into the council chamber. He was 16 years old, small for his age, surrounded by powerful men who had ruled the country since he was a toddler. He didn't look like a revolutionary. He looked like a scared boy. He approached the king. Christian looked up, his eyes unfocused. He saw his son, this young stranger who had his wife's face. "Father," Frederick said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, "I have a document for you to sign." Guldberg froze. Juliana Maria half rose from her seat. "What is this?" she demanded. "The king signs nothing without my approval." Frederick ignored her. He placed the paper in front of the king. It was not a trivial decree. It was an order dismissing the entire cabinet, firing Guldberg, stripping Juliana Maria of her power, and declaring the crown prince as the sole regent. It was a total reversal of the last 12 years. "Sign it," Frederick whispered. Christian looked at the paper. He looked at the quill. Then he looked at Guldberg, who was shouting now, moving toward the king. He looked at his stepmother, whose face was twisted in a mask of fury and fear. The voices of his abusers were loud, screaming at him to stop, to obey, to be the good puppet. But then he looked at Frederick. Maybe in that moment the fog lifted. Maybe he saw a chance for atonement. Maybe he just wanted the shouting to stop. Or maybe deep down he recognized that this was the son Carolyn Matilda had left behind, and this was the only thing he could do for her. King Christian VII picked up the quill. His hand shook as it always did. He dipped it in the ink. And while Juliana Maria screamed, "No," the king signed, "Christian Rex." Pandemonium erupted. Guldberg lunged for the paper. Frederick, anticipating this, grabbed the document and pulled it away. But the struggle wasn't over. This wasn't a debate. It was a physical fight for the crown. The crown prince, holding the future of Denmark in his hands, turned and ran. He literally ran out of the council chamber. Juliana Maria shouted to the guards, "Stop him! It is a coup! Stop the prince!" But Frederick was faster. He bolted down the corridor, clutching the order to his chest, running toward the apartments where his allies were waiting. But he didn't just leave. With the paper, he took the king. In the confusion, Christian VII, seemingly energized by the chaos, rose from his chair and followed his son. It was a bizarre, tragicomic scene. The teenage prince sprinting through the palace, followed by the stumbling, giggling Mad King, followed by the furious ministers of the old regime. They reached the safety of the prince's guards. The doors were slammed shut. The Guldberg era was over. The coup was bloodless, but it was absolute. When the sun set on April 14th, 1784, the power had shifted. Juliana Maria was stripped of her title as regent. She was not executed, nor was she exiled. Frederick was not his step-grandmother. He did not seek blood vengeance. He simply rendered her irrelevant. She was sent to live in quiet retirement, forced to watch from a distance as the boy she had underestimated dismantled her legacy piece by piece. Guldberg was fired and sent away. And Christian? For the king, the change of government meant a change of keepers. But this time, the keeper was benevolent. Frederick didn't lock his father away. He didn't mock him. He didn't force him to sign death warrants. He protected him. For the first time in his life, Christian VII was safe. He was still mad. The voices never went away. The hallucinations never stopped. But the fear was gone. He had been rescued not by a stepmother who wanted his crown, but by a son who wanted his father. The long nightmare of the 18th century was drawing to a close, and the Mad King had survived it all, battered and broken, but still standing. The coup of 1784 was a quiet revolution, a seizure of power executed with the surgical precision of a son who had spent a lifetime studying the mistakes of his elders. When the dust settled in the corridors of Christiansborg, the atmosphere in Denmark shifted from one of fear to one of cautious hope. The Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, the woman who had cast a long, freezing shadow over the monarchy for 12 years, was not dragged to the scaffold. Crown Prince Frederick was too pragmatic for that. He understood that martyrdom breeds sympathy. Instead, he subjected her to a punishment far worse for a narcissist: irrelevance. She was stripped of her influence. Her spies were dismissed, and she was left to wither in the obscurity of her own palaces, forced to watch as the weak grandson she had tried to control systematically dismantled her legacy. For King Christian VII, the change was immediate and profound. Under the Guldberg regime, he had been a prop, a tool to be used and discarded. Under his son, he became a beloved, if broken, patriarch. Frederick VI, as he would later be known, is often described by historians as a stiff military man, but his treatment of his father reveals a deep well of compassion. He didn't lock Christian away in a tower. He didn't try to cure him with beatings or cold baths. He accepted him. He created a protective bubble around the king, a court within a court where Christian could live out his days in relative peace. For the next 24 years, Christian VII lived as a shadow king. He was nominally the absolute ruler of Denmark. His signature was still required on every law, but he was absolved of the burden of thinking. Frederick would bring the papers. He would sit with his father, speak to him gently, and guide his hand. The king signed, not out of fear, but out of trust. The terror that had defined his relationship with Reventlow and Juliana Maria was replaced by a strange, quiet symbiosis. Christian's madness did not disappear, but it changed. The violent, spiked, club-wielding thug of the 1760s softened into an eccentric, gentle ghost. He spent hours in his chambers, engaging in a hobby that was both heartbreaking and revealing. He drew. He sketched portraits of the people he had lost. He drew Struensee. He drew Caroline Matilda. He drew them not as monsters or traitors, but as friends. In these private moments, the king was not mad. He was grieving. He was trying to reconstruct the only time in his life when he had felt loved. He would reportedly speak to them, holding long conversations with the empty air, nodding as if Struensee were still there, giving him advice, smiling as if Caroline were still laughing at his jokes. The court staff learned to respect these invisible companions. They learned that the king lived in a world that was preferable to the reality he had endured. Outside the palace walls, the world was burning. The French Revolution erupted, sending shockwaves of republicanism across Europe. Heads of state were rolling in Paris. But in Denmark, the monarchy remained secure, ironically because of the Mad King's earlier reign. The reforms that Struensee had forced through in 1771, the freedom of the press, the legal protections for the peasantry, had planted seeds that Frederick now watered. The crown prince, ruling in his father's name, enacted the great land reforms, liberating the peasants from the soil. It was the fulfillment of Struensee's dream, achieved not by a radical doctor, but by the son of the queen who had loved him. In a poetic twist of history, the legacy of the man Christian was forced to kill was secured by Christian's own blood. But the 19th century brought a new kind of terror. The Napoleonic Wars were consuming the continent, and Denmark, trying desperately to remain neutral, was caught in the crossfire. In 1801 and again in 1807, the British Royal Navy attacked Copenhagen. The Battle of Copenhagen was a thunderous, fiery catastrophe. The city burned. The British fleet, the same navy that had once carried Christian's mother and wife, rained cannonballs upon his capital. For Christian VII, now an old man in his late 50s, the bombardment must have felt like the apocalypse. The noise was deafening. The sky was black with smoke. His fragile sanctuary was shattered by the very real violence of war. Yet reports from the time suggest a strange reaction. While the sane people of Copenhagen panicked, the Mad King was reportedly calm, almost detached. Perhaps to a man who had lived his entire life in a state of internal chaos, the external chaos of war was nothing new. Or perhaps he simply didn't care anymore. He was tired. In 1808, with the British threatening to invade the mainland, the royal court evacuated to Rendsburg in Holstein. The journey was grueling. The king was frail, his body worn out by decades of nervous exhaustion, and likely the porphyria that had ravaged his system. Rendsburg was not home. It was a military garrison, cold and unfamiliar. On March 13, 1808, the end finally came. King Christian VII suffered a massive stroke. He did not linger. There were no long, drawn-out speeches, no final moments of clarity where he reclaimed his sanity. He simply ceased to be. He was 59 years old. He had been king of Denmark for 42 years, one of the longest reigns in the nation's history, yet he had truly ruled for perhaps none of them. When the news of his death spread, there was no jubilation like there had been when Struensee fell. There was no grand mourning like there had been for his mother. There was just a quiet acknowledgement that a long, painful tragedy had finally finished its run. The king was dead. The puppet strings were cut. The boy who had been beaten in the nursery was finally beyond the reach of the cane. History is often a judge and usually a harsh one. For centuries, Christian VII stood in the dock, accused of weakness, of madness, of destroying the dignity of the crown. He was the punchline of royal history, the insane foil to the brilliant Struensee and the tragic Caroline Matilda. But this verdict is a miscarriage of justice. If you strip away the crown, the velvet, and the titles, what remains is not a villain, but a victim. Christian VII was a crime scene. He was the evidence of what happens when a human soul is subjected to absolute power and absolute neglect. His madness was not a moral failing. It was a survival strategy. It was a fortress he built to protect the last fragments of his self from a world that wanted to consume him. We remember Henry VIII for his tyranny. We remember Louis XIV for his splendor. We should remember Christian VII for his endurance. He survived the sadistic tutelage of Reventlow. He survived the cold ambition of Juliana Maria. He survived the heartbreak of losing his wife and his best friend. He survived the guilt of being their executioner. He carried the weight of a trauma that would have crushed a lesser man, and he carried it for nearly 60 years. But his true legacy is not found in the history books that detail his scandals. It is found in the modern state of Denmark. The liberal reforms that define the nation today, the belief in human rights, the rejection of torture, the freedom of the individual, were born in the chaotic, manic, brief window when Christian VII let his guard down and allowed a dreamer like Struensee to take the wheel. The king didn't write the laws, but his signature, scrawled by a shaking hand, made them reality. He was the broken vessel that carried the water of the Enlightenment. And in the end, there is that drawing. The sketch of Struensee and Brandt, hidden away in the royal archives, it is the final testimony of Christian VII. It tells us that beneath the layers of madness, beneath the dissociation and the fear, there was a man who loved deeply and grieved quietly. I would have liked to save them both. He couldn't save them. He couldn't even save himself. But in remembering his pain and telling his story with the ruthless honesty it deserves, perhaps we can finally offer him the one thing he was denied in life: empathy. The Mad King is dead. Long live the man he could have been.